Hello and good day. Remember, this is not a news show. If you're looking for news, go somewhere else. This is a political platform for ideas and discussion. With that being said, welcome to That Heathen Bastard. Check out the new intro card. Lovely. There will be links in the description below to my books. Please buy, download, and read them. And with that, let's begin. Now, as you might have noticed, things have gotten a little crazy here in America. Much like my hair, I could probably use a haircut. Suffice to say, I wanted to talk to you today about how progressives and progressivism has sort of become leftism light. Now, this is not meant to be inflammatory, so please don't take it that way. This is just simple commentary based on my own personal observations on how I feel about the situation, so we can have that rational, reasonable discussion. Now, the far left has a number of political doctrines that are very popular, most notably intersectionality and CRT. Now, these may not appear far left, and it's not that the far left created these doctrines, but they have more or less fully adopted these doctrines as their own. That alone is not so much guilt by association, but the fact that they use them as personal political doctrines. That is enough to say that they are far left now. They might not have been far left when they were created, but they are now. That is to say, the actual origin of where these things come from is in academics, actually in very questionable academics. A Miss Kimberly Crenshaw is the creator of intersectionality and made contributions to critical race theory. And in many ways, she is a very poor academic. There's lots of people like her in sociology, of poor academics who do very little real field work and generally rely on anecdotal evidence and lived experiences. Now, don't get me wrong, personal experience is fine, but some people are over-reliant on it. They forget the anecdotal nature of personal experience, and the fact that anecdotal evidence still a little gunked up. Anecdotal evidence is the lowest standard of evidence. It's the poorest standard. And even then, if you're going to use an anecdote for evidence, you should make sure that it's a verified anecdote, with at least two or more people witnessing the same event, and then using their POV, which is personal point of view, or their personal point of view, POV, as a contrast. There will be differences between their POV if they're telling the truth. If they're saying the exact same thing, then they recited it. But if they have subtle differences, you take the things they have in common from the different POVs, and whatever they hold in common is therefore the truth of what they saw. Right? Well, the thing is, intersectionality, as far as I know, doesn't even do that. Neither does critical race theory. It takes a lot of anecdotal evidence of, this person did this to me once. It's like, okay, we'll make that as a point of oppression. This person did this to me once. Okay, we'll make that as a point of oppression. That's basically how intersectionality was drawn up, as far as I can tell. Many of her critics have said so, that it's very unscientific. And critical race theory is definitely anti-science when you consider the fact that it tries to say that race is a social construct. Never mind the fact that we can demonstrate melanin and relative face shape, relative nose shape, eye fold, skin color, hair color, etc. Those don't matter. Regional origins and heritage, they don't matter. Race doesn't exist. I mean, come on, how anti-science could you fucking be, right? It's not so much that they're extremists who came up with these ideas as just bad academics who are really bad at their job. That's where they came from. And their use of emotional rhetoric, which is the best way to manipulate someone by using their feelings, it's much harder to manipulate people with logic, because logic is constant, unchanging, and if you have the ability to perceive it, it will always only make sense in the one way, and that one way is true. Right? That's how logic is. It is structured, it is sound, and it only goes one, maybe two directions tops. And even then, those directions of logic are fact-based. Emotions, on the other hand, they shift and they change and they're unstable, especially in a mentally unhealthy person. And it's easy to manipulate people by using sort of that reactionary system and the limbic system. This is how a lot of these doctrines tend to get adopted, is through that emotional rhetoric of oppression, oppression, we will save you, this will help you, etc., etc. Don't look at the facts. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. That's how a lot of these kind of ideas get spread. That certainly isn't Kimberly Crenshaw's style, but people who adopted her ideas definitely spread it further through that method I'm talking about. There's plenty of YouTubers, leftist YouTubers, who use that emotional rhetoric to spread their ideas. That in itself is common, and that in itself is common enough. But that's more or less where it came from. Now, the reason why I say progressive and leftists are so closely related is because they share many of the same spaces, right? Leftists and progressives both go to the liberal arts colleges. They both share a lot of the same forums and areas. They both hang out on Twitter and Tumblr. They share and occupy a lot of the same space. And it's entirely possible that each may end up mistaking the other for being the same thing. A leftist might see a progressive and think they're a fellow leftist, and vice versa, until they begin to clash, which they eventually will, hence the phenomenon of the left eating their own, where they go after one another over their behavior. Right? It's actually a progressive, typically. Either that, or it's a leftist who didn't follow the rules, or wasn't aware and didn't keep up with the constantly changing leftist standards that are so hilariously bad in that way. It's very difficult to keep up, so I'm not surprised that they eventually eat their own. It's like a race where if you lose, you get destroyed by the other racers. I mean, brutal, man, brutal. Remember those little spiders from the movie Lost in Space with Matt LeBlanc? Where they eat their wounded? Yeah, I'd say the leftists are kind of like that in a more philosophical and metaphorical sense, not literally, of course. Ew, do they really do cannibalism? I hope not. But yeah, the progressives and the leftists share many of the same spaces and many of the same forums, and they could easily mistake each other for being a fellow person of their status. And it happens. And in that exchange, a progressive may absorb leftist ideas osmotically. And that's when they sort of begin to resemble each other. Because at the end of the day, you are who you hang out with. And if you spend time around these people, you pick up on their habits, you pick up on their ideas. That's especially true if you're an Aspie. I hate to admit it, but as an Aspie myself, we are kind of impressionable in the sense that we pick up on other people's habits really easily. A friend of mine used to do this thing where he would clap loudly and then rub his hands vigorously and grinning wildly, almost like a hyperactive Mr. Burns. And then later I found I started doing it myself. I hated it, and then I started doing it. Go. Drives me nuts, right? But then I started doing it. Ideas are kind of infectious like that too. And neurotypical people are like that too, but just to a lesser degree. You pick up on other people's habits and you pick up on their ideas osmotically. If you are not self-aware and begin to notice it, they leave an impression on you that affects your behavior. This may actually be an evolutionary process that furthered social cohesion in tribal times. When human tribes had to survive, they all had to behave one exact way. That was the way to survive. And if they didn't act that way, if there were any deviants, those deviants either were punished or they died. And so that sort of evolutionary process of impressionability is likely part of that system. Now, the main differences between leftists and progressives, and especially in the halls of power, mostly you know someone's a progressive when they basically just say things like, the system works, but it can change, right? They celebrate the system, but they see all these problems they want to fix. right? They're problem solvers, or at least they project themselves as that. They want to make progress, hence the term progressive. You want an idea of a progressive philosophy? Watch Star Trek and take a look at the sort of world it projects and the attitudes and the speech making and the syllogisms. That is more or less a progressive worldview in Star Trek. Especially in Star Trek The Next Generation, where it's particularly visible in that sense. Right, so progressives are typically reasonable, friendly, happy, intelligent, but at the same time, they're kind of wistful perfectionists, maybe. Sort of believe in these little fantasies. Like, many of them are actually socialists. They think that the socialist paradise, the Marxist paradise, can possibly work, even though it really can't. They're romantics. They're very much romanticists. They're mostly harmless, but they're very romantic. And, when they have a criticism of the system, I have always had the policy of just to listen, just in case they're right. If you assume they're wrong, and you're wrong about their being wrong, it's a mistaken assumption, then, well, the best way to make an assumption is to evaluate, is the risk of me being wrong greater than the reward of me being right? If the risk is greater, then it's a bad assumption. If the reward is greater, then it's a good assumption. And assuming that someone's wrong, if you're mistaken about their being wrong, then that can have dire consequences. So it's better to assume that they at least might be right, and therefore act upon that assumption and give them a chance to prove they're right. Assume that they may be right, and proceed. Now, leftists, on the other hand, are more extreme. They're basically typically communist or socialist revolutionaries. They're okay with the riots. They're okay with violence. They really don't seem to give a shit. It's like, bitch, I do what I want, long live the revolution, burn down capitalism. So we're pretty much talking about your Antifas and your BLMs, the rioters, like burning down Portland and shit. In many ways, their ideas are similar to progressives. They just take it to an unhealthy and unholy extreme. They're like progressives on steroids. They just go to a whole nother level of insanity. Now, taking that into consideration, how the dangers of these leftists and how they can sort of blend in with progressives if they're behaving calm and being relatively sane and articulate, versus their usual extremism, viva la revolution, and so forth. The differences between them can be so subtle, but you always know someone's a leftist and not simply a progressive when they go to a really extreme version of that talking point. Like saying, if we don't get the verdict we want in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, we're going to attack the courthouse, threaten the jurists, and burn down a building. That's when you know they're a fucking leftist. A mere progressive is not going to do that. They may even decry such behavior as wrong. And they typically will. So essentially, leftists have sort of infected the progressive milieu and mindset to the point where they begin to resemble each other. But you can always tell them apart based on the level of extremism. Now, leftists and progressives in the halls of power. First, I want to discuss the progressives in the halls of power. And now, historically speaking, since our government has done a progressive shift, the old conservative government in the United States is gone. Like the last true era of conservative politics in the government, Reagan was president. The old guard conservatives fell away, and the progressive politicians and the progressive ideas took over. We traded George H.W. Bush for Bill Clinton. There was a brief resurgence. Then we got Obama. And then progressives had all the power during Trump. And then now we have progressive Joe Biden, who is a fucking racist and a sexist asshole. and yet they vote for him anyway. Even though they supposedly hate that shit, they voted for him anyway. Biggest hypocrites. But since the government has been progressive, they've proven one thing unmistakably, and that is conservatives are better at governing. Progressives can't govern. That's just not what they're good at. Because of the nature of the way they think, their mindset, their philosophy, they're much better at finding flaws in a system and then persuading people to fix the problem. But when it comes to actually running the system itself, that critical analysis sort of runs amok. And suddenly everything looks wrong to them because they don't actually understand the system as fully as a conservative. Because the conservative philosophy and mindset is about analyzing the system, working the system, and using hard work and know-how to make the system work. It's a completely different way of looking at it. If you're looking at the system from a critical, analytical standpoint while you're in it, you're overly critical, unfair, and generally tend to cause things to break down because of the mindset and the approach. Take, for example, progressive governance here on the West Coast is saying, oh, we can't tell drug addicts that they have something wrong with them and they have a problem. That's politically incorrect. We can't tell the homeless that's politically the same thing as politically incorrect. Even though that's what they need to hear, so they have motivation to go into AA, like 12-step programs, and get clean. Right? That's their motivation. Acknowledging that the problem exists, and then getting in the system so that we can help you. Right? But no, that's politically incorrect. That's offensive. That's dirty. And that's one of the ways in which they screw everything up around here. To the point where you can go to Seattle, into the burbs, and see a full-grown ass man taking a shit in the middle of the street in broad daylight. Which is something my own brother actually witnessed once, which is why he hates going to Seattle. Because he sees that shit all the time, every time he visits there. The worst thing I've experienced going to Seattle is being like in a four-way gridlock. On the road, in a car. Like, that was nuts. At one point, our driver was saying that I should probably get out and see how far it goes. But thankfully, the traffic cleared up after a while. But that was nuts. Like, wow. Like, I believe my brother because he's not really a liar. And that fits with the statistical data I've seen and with the news analytics I've seen of progressive governance just kind of falling apart. Many AA and 12-step programs have been defunded. Many AD, anti-drug addiction, even anti-sex addiction. Many of these places get defunded because they're politically incorrect institutions. You know, and healthcare policies which literally in California resulted in a return of the Black Plague. One of the most deadly and most influential diseases in the history of Western civilization, especially if you have European heritage, to the point where people of European heritage can look back on their people's history and sometimes even get a little misty-eyed. They feel like crying because literally almost everyone had the plague and 60% of the population of continental Europe died. And that bullshit made a motherfucking comeback in California because of their failing health policies. Yeah, progressives really do not know how to govern. They're well-meaning people, they're not malevolent, but they do not know what they are doing. They are fucking it up on so many levels, it is not even funny. The only reason why America is even still a strong nation at all is because of all of the infrastructure that was built up during past decades. It's a strong enough infrastructure that even they can't fuck it up completely. Leftists, on the other hand, I think, honestly, on some points they can actually govern just fine. But since they are extremists, their main issue is to use the power of their political office to further their activistic agenda. So people get left behind, and they basically get punished for not fully conforming to the extremist position. They defend the violence. They get the rioters off. They make sure that the bail amounts are small, that they're easily released. You pay like an itty-bitty fine and then walk free, and you're allowed to be a repeat offender. You get mayors elected in Portland to say, I am Antifa, and then that becomes sort of, you realize you got an Antifa fucking mayor who's probably been at a riot or two. I guarantee you that she's been in a riot or two. The leftists use the political platforms, and even when they become journalists, they use their position to insert the ideology and to gain institutional power. It is to infiltrate and change from within. That is why they are more dangerous than the far right and rightists. Leftists are more dangerous than QAnon because Q has no power, has no institutional power. They're a bunch of fringe wackos. What people don't understand is on the right, such groups are actually frowned upon and shamed for being insane. Right? Whereas leftists are way stealthier. They resemble progressives in many ways. They're their distinctions are subtle. And you could easily mistake them for a progressive and they blend in real easy. Rightists, on the other hand, they're much more obvious, much more extreme and out in the open. You can always tell an alt-righter from a real conservative. You can always tell a white nationalist from just a regular white person. You can always tell them apart because it's super obvious. To some extent, a QAnoner could blend in with just a regular conservative Christian in America, right? But there will always be some telltale signs that you know who they are. Just ask them the right question, and they'll just blurt it out. They are not anywhere near as deceptive, and they're very much in the open about what they believe. They're kind of like flat earthers in that way. Flat earthers are not ashamed of their ridiculousness. They probably should be, but they're not. But that's just kind of how leftists and progressives act in the halls of power. But when it comes right down to it, progressivism really is just leftism light. It's just the less extreme version because they believe in many of the same things. They believe in intersectionality, they believe in CRT, and all that. Now, mind you, someone who's only slightly left of center, there's some progressives who will reject those doctrines, but there's many more who will not. This is based on my own personal experience, of course, as well as hearing many of the progressive talking points and recognizing how casually they use intersectional and CRT-related things like gender theory and African-American theory and so forth. And they'll just use it casually as though it were normal, regular language. Probably because they don't know that they've been infected with leftist ideology. They may not even be fully aware of it. They may just take it as a normal liberal arts thing. Which it typically is presented as such, and probably started out that way before the extremists adopted it and started doing their thing with it. So it really is just leftism light, because they follow many of the same ideas. Now, in order to prevent these ideas from being passed on to the next generation, which is necessary, we need to stop them from reproducing these ideas and forcing them on the next generation. And one of the best ways to do that is homeschooling as an anti-far left tactic to protect the next generation from their toxic ideas, is homeschooling, getting them out of the system. And really, since you chose to reproduce, educating your child is your responsibility anyway. It's not the state's responsibility, it should be yours, right? They're your child. Putting them in the hands of someone else for part of the day, right, is essentially like temporarily shirking your responsibility as a parent. Which I am not okay with. Many other people are not okay with. It's a bit of a minority opinion at this point, but it's still out there in the ether that, like, hey, they're your child. They're not the state's child, they're your child. So why aren't you taking the initiative to be there to raise the kid? Are you a boomer? Are you an irresponsible, selfish boomer? Because you're kind of looking that way. Now, I know I don't have any children of my own, but I have been a very active and supportive uncle. I have had to discipline the children. I have helped to take care of them in the past. I'm a good disciplinarian. I know how to care for a kid, all that. I have the experience. So I do know what I'm talking about. Okay? I have experience being a live-in babysitter for a while. A sort of a nanny, kind of, with my nephews. I have experience helping raise the kids. So suffice to say, that I can reflect on and saying, yeah, you cannot afford to sacrifice the responsibility. Even if that means that you can't do all the things you want to do. But you have to be on the kid 24/7. That's the reality of being irresponsible for a child. If you don't like it, don't have a kid. If you want to have a kid, be ready to be there 24/7. All the time. If you shirk the responsibility to someone else, don't be surprised when they start doing things in a way you don't like. Because guess what? They're not you. They have different ideas about how to care for a child. And they could very well easily come along and corrupt your child. Right? That is so typical. That is so typical of the school system. You know, so take the responsibility, homeschool them, and then you won't have to worry about intersectionality and CRT being presented to them uncritically. Also, there's some other tactics. You can create an alternative, because the leftists are saying that the leftists, even the progressives, are saying we need CRT in schools to teach history accurately. So one way to remove that argument and eliminate that argument is to create an alternative that doesn't push a pseudoscience about race not existing and it's a social construct. Creating an alternative. Create an alternative history course that has all the true facts in it. Create an alternative theory about race. Create something so that takes away their excuse. It takes away their argument. So they can no longer use that. Because that's actually a pretty powerful argument, as proven to be powerful. Take away the argument by presenting an alternative, so they can no longer use it. Similarly, we can present alternatives to intersectionality, where they talk about points of oppression. Right? We can sort of replace that by saying, oh, we have these ethical rules about how to treat someone, and if someone defies the rules, that person is a bad person, they're an asshole. And that can be presented as a kind of alternative, removing their argument for the need of intersectionality. Why do we need intersectionality? We already have a solution. Right? Like people say, oh, socialism for insulin, because insulin prices are insane. Well, capitalism already has a solution to that. Being able to make legislation so that you can make generic brand insulin. Because the reason why insulin prices were so high is because there was no generic brand insulin. The solution in the system already existed. They either didn't find it or didn't want to find it. But it already existed. So if we provide a solution that already exists, then the arguments for intersectionality and CRT will begin to crumble. And they will have to regroup and try again with a different argument. And good luck. Because we've already seen that shit. We all know the song. We've all heard it. There's nothing you can do that's going to convince us at this point. We've all heard the rigmarole. That's a few tactics that you can use. Creating alternatives, creating, homeschooling. Doing a few debunks, creating some debunks after doing some in-depth research. That sort of thing. Now, I also want to discuss independent journalists. Guys like Tim Pool and Andy Ngo, who are smeared by the far left as fascists and Nazis and racists and right-winger. Yeah, they use right-wing as a pejorative. That's another way to tell if someone's a leftist instead of a progressive, is if they use right-wing as a pejorative. That's telltale sign. These guys, Tim Pool and Andy Ngo, they are champions of this kind of fight, which is why they get smeared. Because they know that Andy Ngo is going to get Antifa footage proving that the riots exist and that things are way, way out of control, so that the progressives in their ivory towers can witness the truth, and only cognitive dissonance will protect them from that truth. But the thing about cognitive dissonance is you can work people through it. There are ways to do that, to resolve it and get them to accept the truth. And Tim Pool who is one of my major news sources. He's very critical, he's very accurate, he's very honest, he considers all the angles, he even uses some fake news sources that he can contrast with real news sources. The dude is in-depth. He is the best news source I've seen. He will tell you the truth. I like to couple him with, to get my news, I like to couple him with Styx Hexenhammer 666, who's the commentator. I get Tim Pool for news and then him for commentary. And then sometimes I'll do Next News Network, which has proven to be pretty accurate for the most part. Occasionally they'll get a conspiracy theorist on there and they'll talk about it. And they'll accept what he says, but then try to sort of be critical of his ideas. And sometimes they might even have a big fight. But at the end of the day, what we need to be doing more than anything is we need to be building culture and preserving it. Because these leftists keep inserting their ideology into everywhere they go. As they go out into the world, they get regular jobs, and they do regular people things. Everywhere they go, even if they, like, say, get a job at a bank. If they work at a bank, they're going to insert their ideology into the bank. Right? That's how they do it. They get into the job, and they just insert the ideology everywhere. This is why Kathleen Kennedy, a leftist, has been ruining Disney Star Wars projects, or Disney in general at Lucasfilm. This is why many other things are ruined. It's because they inject the toxic ideology into everything. In order to prevent this poisonous degradation of society, we need to build new properties and new ideas and new forms of entertainment and new culture, new activities that they haven't gotten into yet, and then preserving them. Creating a barrier saying, we do not hire leftists in this institution. We do not hire leftist writers on this show. We do not hire leftist commentators in this sport. We do not hire leftist judges. Your ideology is not welcome here. This is not yours, this is ours. And we made this for the people. We will not let you destroy it. We will replace the old guard media with the new guard media. That's part of the reason why I'm writing my books, writing my stories. So we have something new to enjoy, not infected with leftism. And something you can jizz your pants over. If you love sci-fi dramas or horror, I got you covered. Mind you, I'm still a very young, new, fresh author. I'm always trying new stuff. I'm always trying new ideas. But that's what you gotta do. You gotta take your talents and you gotta build a legacy and then defend it from the crazy wokeists. Anyway, when it comes right down to it, that's just how it is. Progressivism and leftism, progressivism really is leftism light. Leftism is a toxic ideology. And I've given you the tools necessary to tell them apart. And I've given you the tools necessary to talk about progressives. And how to talk with progressives, perhaps. Maybe that can be the subject of another video of how to discuss with progressives the toxic nature of the things that they've decided to adopt. Because who knows, maybe they don't know yet. In which case, regular-ass people like you and me are going to have to explain it to them. Anyway, that's about all. Tschüss. Peace.